Uh, Ideally, write out your questions first, or at least have it kind of clear in your mind, and we can have a time of hopefully open discussion on the topics of whatever they've talked about so far. And I'm sure much more besides. So the first question that I have, it's actually for Kevin. I was talking to someone in the hallway who was saying brilliant stuff on the conscience. But a lot of what you're talking about and what people talk about on the conscience is kind of how to resist authority. It's God's, Bible versus this authority. But the conscience is something that should be positively formed under authority. And sometimes you might be in a church that you're uncomfortable with. You're, let's say, an Anabaptist background. You come to a PCA church and you feel uncomfortable under your authority. So how do you think about positively forming this person's conscience under the authority of your church when a lot of the language and ways that we talk about conscience is almost purely resisting authority? So, how do you talk about that?
That's a good insight because there can be a tendency, given the quotation from Luther and the emphasis I gave on liberty, yes, to think of conscience as that thing that enables us, empowers us to resist tyranny. And of course, that's not mainly, hardly at all, how it's used in the scriptures, as pointed out from Romans 2. It's that prosecuting attorney and that's defense attorney. So, I think tangibly in my congregation, for example, we have, every new members class, we have a lot of Baptists. We probably got some Baptists here. Okay. We love you. And the question is sometimes put rather bluntly, all right, how much of this do I have to agree with to be a member here of your church? And we have some membership vows in the PCA, and they're very basic evangelical kind of, you only have to affirm a few things. But we go through the Westminster Confession, at least at a high level in our new members class, and we highlight those things that may be distinct from some other churches and traditions, the 5 points of Calvinism and some Presbyterian polity and the sacrament. So that's usually the one. And my answer is we are happy to have you be a member here. We want you to know what we teach. And I wouldn't want you to come here, and this is getting to your question, Wyatt, about a conscience formed under authority. If a Baptist brother is coming into our church with the idea that I'm going to make this Presbyterian church a Baptist church, I'd say that's not the place for you, nor reverse if it's a Presbyterian in a Baptist setting. And I would hope also that perhaps the person might lean in just a little bit to say, I'm here at this church. I'm submitting myself to the government and discipline of this church. I may not be convinced. Uh, I am with a glad heart, eager to hear how this church explains the sacraments. And I do a 5-minute explanation every time we have an infant baptism. We just had a longtime member. I don't know. It's not the Tiber. It's not the whatever you swim into Anglicanism. What's the river around Geneva or something? Just pulling him finally over, the Thames into the I don't know the Schuylkill into Philadelphia or something, into the Presbyterian fold. And his attitude. He grew up. PK's dad's a Baptist pastor, so I said, I absolutely do not want you to affirm this if you don't believe it. He's been asked to be an officer, and that's when he said several years ago, I really can't be an officer. So good on him for having that integrity. I said, I want you to be convinced. And yet, here's being formed, I think, under a proper authority. His posture, it took many years to get there, was, I'm ready. Can you convince me?
Mhm.
I'm I want to hear. I'm very open to hear. Now, not every Baptist who's in our church needs to have that level of I'm just about ready to come over. It took him many years. But I think that was a really mature attitude to, one, adhere to his conscience and not do the easy, really would have been the easy thing to say, yep, I'm here. His wife wanted the kids baptized. I could be a church officer. Let's go with it. But really to work hard over many years to find his conscience instructed until he could finally say with a clear conscience that this is what he believes.
Okay. Helpful. Uh, Thank you for that. And I want to now transition to asking Carl a question. Said I was going to give you an easy one, but I decided not to.
Oh,
You made a You said a phrase yesterday. I wrote it down. You said transgenderism is really a subspecies of transhumanism.
Yeah.
And transhumanism for me is guys like Brian Johnson who are trying to scientifically modify their body to live forever. You kind of alluded to that.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that? Because I think that's a really intriguing idea. It's almost a bigger subset of things where transgenderism is the subset. But I think the transhumanism discussion is exploding, even if the transgender one is maybe kind of retreating a little bit into our space. Can you just talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think the thing that binds transgenderism and transhumanism together is an attitude to the limits, the givenness of the human body.
Mm,
That's the key. Uh, when I treated the LGBTQ stuff in the book, I treat it very much as a political phenomenon.
right.
I think it's a coalition that existed when it did exist because it was united by a common foe.
Mm,
For want of a better term, it was united by opposition to white, heterosexual, male normativity. A bit
mm,
of an inelegant mouthful, but essentially that was the problem. What's interesting to me is that as white, heterosexual, male normativity has got weaker,
mm,
the alliance has started to crumble.
mm,
Uh, when you think about it, that makes sense because take a guy like Andrew Sullivan, for example. Uh, I was interviewed by Andrew Sullivan, interestingly enough, on the same day that President Biden signed into law the Respect for Marriage Act. And before we got into the interview, I asked Andrew, well, why aren't you at the White House? You of all intellectuals sort of helped pave the way for Obergefell and gay marriage and that. And his comment to me was, he said, oh, I'm one of the enemy now.
mm,
And I jokingly said to him, yeah, you're only one, but I said, I'm a white male heterosexual. You're a white male
mm,
homosexual. I said, you're only 1 point above me.
mm,
And by the way, I'm a first generation graduate. So maybe on the intersectional hierarchy, we're actually at the same place. But it makes, what's the problem with Andrew? Andrew's problem is he's not sexually attracted to women presenting as men.
mm,
He regards the body as somehow normative for the nature of sexual desire.
mm,
He's now a transphobe. So the alliance was never built on any solid positive foundation. And that's what I think, points to what's really going on in transgenderism. The body is a problem.
mm,
Who I am is not my body.
mm,
My body is a hindrance, quite possibly, to who I really am. And therefore, maybe it's the mortality of my body, maybe it's the sexual specificity of my body.
right.
These are things that stand in the way of my full realization of who I really am and need to be technologically modified in some way.
I think that's so helpful because we're all these conversations about the vibe shift, how we're turning a corner. There's a heightened rejection of some of the LGBTQ
Yeah.
things. The author of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling's, but there seems to be this explosion of transhumanism
Mm.
that maybe the story is a bit gainsaid through this, and you kind of made me connect some dots yesterday. So I want to think about that more,
Yeah.
but I won't do it in public in front of all of you.
And this is where, think
Yeah.
about, I know that there's
Yeah.
been big falling out between Elon Musk and
Yes, and
Donald
Elon
Trump.
is the transhuman.
Yeah. I've said this before. He was killing the stick shift. That's been the problem with Elon Musk for a long, long time. Killing real driving.
Right.
But I don't say this out of any pleasure at the suffering that Elon Musk's family have experienced in the transition. But praise God that the Lord used his experience in his family for him to be a real force for good in the current administration relative to the transition.
Mm,
But he's also very pro stuff that one would regard as transhumanism,
Yeah.
eugenesis.
Yeah.
Praise God for his inconsistency.
Right.
But, is Elon Musk part of the solution or part of the problem? I
Mm,
think you can make a case either way, depending on the issue. That's why I think Christians we constantly need to be not just focusing upon the immediate symptoms, but thinking behind the symptoms to the sort of assumptions that are actually
yeah.
lying behind a lot of this stuff.
Right.
And I talk about vibe shift. I'm not prepared to say we've won on the trans issue yet either. I think we made some good headway, but I think we need to we need to stay very alert on that issue because it is not done yet.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, feel free to add anything too if you want to, or else I'll open it up to the group.
Well, just on that last thought, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work in his book, The Righteous Mind, and he looks at moral formation, and he has 5 or 6 different categories, how people make moral judgments. And his argument in that book, and he's sort of an old-fashioned liberal, which now makes him something of a conservative. But his argument is that, especially progressives, but I would say most people, unless you're very religious, in Western culture, the only matrix you have for moral decisions that carry weight with others is the harm matrix.
Mm.
So there's a reason that gay marriage, Christians had such a hard time getting traction with that. There is harm to gay so-called marriage. It's not always immediately evident. I think the transgender issue is easier to make the harm argument. You can just put a video up and you can see that's a guy with long hair who just beat all the girls in the track race. You can have a mom say this guy was in the girls' bathroom. You can even have parental stories. This is what it did in my family. Those can get traction. So that's why I think Carl is wise here. That yes, there has been a shift and something of a retreat on some of those, but the reason it's been able to happen is because it's hit that same matrix. I don't think the cultural moral formation matrix has changed. We found one, and so the danger is as soon as the transgender movement can tap in once again to an oppressed minority, you'll have the harm matrix on their side. And I think this was in Ireland, when they had some referendum years ago on gay marriage, and they had an advertisement on TV, and it was very effective, and it was a couple going door to door, knocking and saying, a man and woman, can we get married? Can we get married? And what's this about? And then the hook at the end is, how would you feel if you had to get everyone else's permission to marry the one that you love? Well, very, we don't agree with it, but it's very effective in just a momentary 30-second, not even an argument, but a mood that says you're the cultural aggressor. You're the one who's harming good, innocent people who just want to marry the person they love. And we didn't have arguments that won the day, which doesn't mean we didn't have better arguments. I remember Carl saying years ago, we didn't lose the argument on gay marriage. And somebody said, well, what do you mean? And you said, well, it wasn't really an argument.
Yeah.
We lost a feeling in a mood. And so I think that's still possible for sure on the transgender issue.
Well, and it's interesting. The first thing you zero in on there is women's sports. Yeah, praise God that women's sports have got this issue into the headlines. It's got the traction. But I have to say, that's the most trivial of if you're going to look at the impact of transgenderism, guys competing in women's, certainly non-contact sports, that's the most trivial of all. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not fair that some mediocre male swimmer destroys a top-ranked female swimmer, but that's not the equivalent of childhood genital mutilation. It's not the equivalent of male rapists being housed in women's prisons. It's odd that the most trivial thing has become the most powerful weapon in the public square. And I wouldn't say that's disturbing, but it's not great grounds for huge confidence.
It sounds like an institution needs to write a book on a Protestant theology of the body.
Yeah, that might be a...
Think of one that might want to do that. I'm going to open it up to questions. So stick up your hand and I'll... Okay. I will pick and then the mic will go. So I think you were first there. And just address it to one... I mean, both of you can answer, but just be clear who you're addressing. Say your question and then we'll go from there.
Thanks. This one's for Kevin. Appreciated your talk last night. I was hoping that you could go into a little bit what you think are the sources that Paul's working from as he's writing about conscience. Because I don't see the concept so much in the Old Testament, and you were focusing more on kind of how it was being used in kind of the early modern period. what sources is Paul drawing on, and kind of what's going on there that's maybe unique?
That's a great question. I wonder if you have if it's leading towards what you think, because I would guess there's some background of Stoicism, which doesn't have to be a bad thing. We know in Romans 1, for example, that the language of contrary to nature is familiar language among the Stoics. So I would think the conscience is an element of that. And, Luke references it in Acts a number of times, Peter once in First Peter. So, yeah, it's interesting that it's not in the Old Testament in the same way. So certainly some of the Greco-Roman philosophy in the air is being used and turned for Christian purposes. So it's a good question. I don't know deeper than that.
All right. Scott, I think you were the first to hand up, and we'll go over to you, then back to this side.
Yeah, Carl, I'm thinking back to your remarks yesterday at the beginning where you talked about that expressive individualism naturally progresses to transgressive individualism. And you used an early example from Zwingli's time in Zurich, where the Butchers Guild decided to transgress the Lenten fast by, eating pork sausages during Lent simply to make a point, so it seemed. Then back up to, or come forward to Brad Gregory's book, The Unintended Reformation, blaming all the ills, essentially, all the ills of expressive individualism on the Protestant Reformation itself. So is Brad Gregory right? Are we the source of all problems that are afflicting the world today?
Do you still
Yeah.
stand by the review you did of that
I
book?
did a 2-part review of that
Yeah.
many, many years
It
ago.
was Carl unhinged in the best way.
Yeah, I may withdraw some of the adjectives now.
Yeah,
I suspect if I looked
It was
at it.
punchy, Carl. I like that.
I, there are various ways one could approach that. For those not familiar with Brad Gregory essentially makes the argument that Protestantism is, breaks culture, or ultimately it shatters the authority of the church, and it paves the way for the sort of the chaos of modernity. Few things that one can say about that. One thing that I think I said in the review was, Protestantism is actually a response to the corruption of late medieval Catholicism. So whatever else you can do, you can't really do what Gregory's doing, and that's presenting Catholicism as the answer, because Catholicism has already disintegrated, even on his own account, to such a point that Protestantism is able to emerge. So that would be one angle. Second angle I might take is, the printing press, the rise of the cities, the rise of the guilds. Something's going to blow in the 16th century. We don't know what it is. It happens to be profoundly shaped by this strange figure, Martin Luther. More than any other reformer, Luther puts his stamp on the Reformation. Something's going to blow. You're not going back to the 13th century. So one could take that approach. Thirdly, you could look at expressive individualism, and I get this question from students a lot. Is it all bad? To which my answer is no. What I'm doing really in my book, a lot of it is just describing. And I would want to say that what does Protestantism bring to the table that I think is missing in medieval Catholicism? And the thing I think that Protestantism brings more than anything else, I sort of alluded to it this morning in the lecture, is it brings an existential urgency. It may be that the emphasis on the first person singular in modernity has wreaked havoc, but it's there in the New Testament. Paul is very clear that this comes down to you at some level. So then for me it becomes an issue of, is Protestantism a price? Is chaos of modernity a price worth paying to recapture from the New Testament what I think had been lost in the Middle Ages? And I think your answer to that question is going to come down to whether you're a Protestant or a Catholic or not. Though I always delight in pointing out to my Catholic students that they too are Protestants these days. They choose to be Catholics. They have an option not to be. They have to choose to be Catholic, so they're kind of Protestant too. So that would be how I would go. That I think Gregory's absolutely right that the 15th, 16th century is a watershed. The shattering of the sort of unified church authority it has no precedent in the previous 1,000. Everything changes after Luther's excommunicated and will continue to unravel and change for centuries. So Gregory's absolutely right, I think, in zeroing in on late Middle Ages Reformation as being a major cultural event, the like of which it's hard to quantify. Whether it's the bad thing he claims it is, I'm inclined to say that's a mixed thing. Bottom line is, I don't want to live in the 13th century. I want to live in a century where we have flush toilets, antibiotics, painkillers, and I would add martinis. Well, all four things, I suspect, are the products of modernity. And all four things are well worth having. Mountain Dew. Maybe I sympathize with Gregory on Mountain Dew, actually, but no, I would say it's
down from Mount Hermon.
Yes, it's a great question. A couple of years ago, I taught the history department, got me to do the historical methods class at Grove. And it was a mixed class. I got some Catholics and some Protestant students, and I thought, we'll spend 3 or 4 weeks reading Gregory. And so we read this book as a class. And at the end of it, I took a vote on who thinks he got it right and who thinks he got it wrong. It divided absolutely down confessional lines. All the Protestants thought it was awful and all the Catholics thought it was great. But I think it's a price worth paying because much as I love the theology of Thomas Aquinas, much of it, I don't find that New Testament. You must believe there. And that's not to say Thomas has nothing good to say, far from it. But there's something missing there. And I'm not sure how one can bring that back in without something like the Reformation and the consequent problems that come with the Reformation as well. It's a little bit like religious freedom. Is religious freedom a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's a really good thing. But it will always tend to make religion a consumer commodity. It carries that with it. But I don't want to worship in a country where the government tells me if I can worship, where I can worship, how I have to worship. I pay the price in order for what I think is a greater good there.
Good.
I heard one of my church history professors would say provocatively, and he's Reformed, he would say to Catholic students that Roman Catholicism didn't exist until after the Reformation either. Making the same sort of point in a provocative way, at least as you know it. The
Council of Trent.
The Council of Trent, the hard edges on justification against a Lutheran understanding of justification. You point this out in your review of Gregory, which is worth reading. Yeah, you want to talk about disintegration. You have for 2 centuries. You can't figure out who's the real pope. The popes, even by Roman Catholic historians, have to admit, or some nasty, nasty individuals, from Pope Boniface VIII to the Borgia popes. And you have the conciliar movement can't decide who the popes are. So there is a disintegration. It wasn't that the Catholic Church is humming along in great unity from strength to strength, and then Luther blows it up. It was in desperate need of reform. And in many ways, Protestant and Catholicism, as we know it now, are 2 different ways at the reform in late medieval church that everyone recognizes needed to happen.
Yeah. Protestantism is the answer to the crisis of late medieval Catholicism. You may consider it the wrong answer, but it's the answer, not the source of the problem.
Mm-hmm. And I think if you go, there's a line, of course I don't have it right at my fingertips, but Bavinck in explaining the perspicuity of Scripture basically says what Carl was putting into his mouth, which is he owns all of the problems that come with a doctrine of the perspicuity of Scripture, that you have a right to read Scripture for yourself. And then he says, it's worth it. It's worth it to not have the oppression, to have the freedom to organize your churches as you see fit. And he gives a very thorough Protestant answer on, yes, there are going to be trade-offs. We always have to remember what we have in this life is not perfection or this thing. We have this thing or that thing. And so there's bound to be trade-offs.
I think I said over here was going to be next. You had your hand up over here. So while you're walking to that side of the room, on the conscience question, Max Lee's book, Moral Transformation in Greco-Roman Philosophy of Mind by Morzebek, has a lot of really cool stuff
right.
on
Right.
what you're asking. Max Lee, so like
Mhm.
Jet Li, I don't know.
This can be both of you, one of you, whoever wants to go for it. I was very struck by Dr. Trueman's reflections on transgression. I think that's very powerful, and I think we were talking about how the LGBTQ thing is kind of falling apart because it doesn't have any unifying principle. I would say maybe its unifying principle was always just transgression, just a stepping over a line. It seems to me, though, after hearing Dr. DeYoung's talk, that there is something justly, rightly transgressive about Luther. So I'm wondering when, as Protestants, we're protesting something, right? I mean, we just kind of talked about this. When is it right to transgress? When is it wrong to transgress? If our principle, theologically, is that we are resisting, a religious authority, a so-called, religious authority.
I'll give a brief answer, but I'd love to hear what Carl says on that. I think as you know, one of the things the reformers were always emphasizing when they said, "Where was your church before Luther?" They wanted to go back. They wanted to claim all of that. I teach a Sunday school class every fall, doing it over 4 years, going through the history of the church. And so I want to do Gregory the Great, and I'm going to do I did Benedict, and I want to say these are our guys too, even where don't agree with that particular theological point or emphasis. So when it's transgressive for the sake of being transgressive, look at when I hit publish on this, that's naughty. Look at that. And everybody comes along. Give you an example, and easy for me to say that I thought this back then, and you can choose to believe me or not if I was prescient or not. But, I've had a front row seat to the so-called Young Restless Reformed, DeYoung Restless Reformed. It was named after me, basically. Now I'm de-old, as they said, as the pun. But I did think, even at its heyday, and I think its demise has been exaggerated in some ways. It's just the togetherness is what's fallen apart. And I want to say, you know where else togetherness has fallen apart? Everywhere. That's what the digital space does. It makes tribes smaller, more intense, less of a barrier to entry, and it makes together more difficult. You can just look at the names. I'm thinking in American space in particular, from the 90s into 2000s, the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, the Gospel Coalition, Together for the Gospel. These are all names. We have various people coming together. But I remember thinking at sort of the height of some of that, I could just sniff around that it seemed like there was a good number of people that were there poking against the attractional megachurch thin model they grew up with. And this Calvinism was the thing that enabled them to be transgressive. And in some ways, it's I think we suffer from our own success, if you want to claim that as ours, that now mainstream are those things. I mean, Gospel Coalition, like it or not, and it has elements of both, but is mainstream. And so I think it was incumbent and often a weakness of that kind of new Calvinism movement to not root people into history. The number of folks who were so nervous, they wanted to be big God theology. They didn't want to call it Calvinism, or they didn't want to get deep into a tradition. Well, then you're going to be swept away by the next thing that comes when it's the next new fun thing, whether it's social justice or it's reparations or it's John Mark Comer. I'm not saying those are all the same things, but whatever, it kind of, there's something else that allows us. So I think to do what one of the things I'm sure Davenant is most adamant about is going deep into a tradition, into our traditions, which helps us to be not just protesting something, but firmly for something even better.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would agree with all of what Kevin said. That I would also add that we typically think of what we should resist. I would also suggest we need to think very deeply about how we should resist. I think a very good question to ask is, when I'm making my stand on X, Y, or Z, am I doing it in order to edify the church or to draw attention to myself? There's a very good article. It's on the Humanum website. Humanum is a sort of online journal published by the John Paul II Institute at Catholic University of America. There's a very good article there by the Catholic philosopher D.C. Schindler. The title is, it's a great title. I love it. Social media is hate speech. You get the argument in the title. You don't even need to read the article. But what he does there is he really argues that it was Twitter then, it's X now, I guess. Seems easier to call it Twitter. He essentially argues that, and I sort of was drawing on it last night when I made my comments about the economy of social media. He makes the argument there that the form of Twitter is not a medium for the communication of truth. It's a form for the promotion of self. It's a very good argument that he makes. And it got me thinking, and I did a short piece at First Things a little while back about this, but it got me thinking about the Reformation. Drawing I'm a history guy, I was thinking, what are the analogies? Thinking, it's interesting that, the Reformation, this is somewhat simplistic, but we might perhaps break Reformation literature into two categories: serious stuff and the pamphlets.
Mhm.
And what's the stuff that is still edifying to the church today? It's the serious stuff. If you're a Catholic, it's Ignatius's Exercises. If you're a Lutheran, it's the it's the Small Catechism or Freedom of the Christian Man. If you're Reformed, it's Calvin's Institutes or it's Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. The only people who read the pamphlets now are scholars of Reformation propaganda and pamphlets. Pamphlets were not designed to, by and large, promote sane arguments. They were designed to discredit the opposition. That was the burden of them. So I would say when you're thinking, there's this thing coming up that I need to resist, don't just ask yourself, where's the line to be drawn, but also ask yourself, how do I do this in a way that edifies the church? Takes a necessary stand, but edifies the church and doesn't just make me into a glorious Martin Luther kind of figure. So I think that's the kind of question we need to ask. And that's why I find I have not spent any of my time on social media. Partly I always joke that, if I'm going to lose my job, I want to lose it for a whole paragraph, not for 140 characters. I'm going to go down. I was protested at a college a year or two ago. Very polite protest, but the two people who protested were myself and Lila Rose, the pro-life activist. And I sent a spy over to the protest area to see what was going down. And they said it was so funny that Lila Rose is on Twitter, so they'd got all these sound bites on their banners. They couldn't get any sound bites. They actually had people standing up reading whole paragraphs of mine that they found. I said, great. So they're actually getting an argument from me, even as they're protesting me. So I would say, when you think about resistance, don't just think about where the line's drawn, but think about the way that you do it. That there are ways of resisting that actually edify and upbuild the church. And ultimately, that's why we resist things, because we think they're harming the church. So we don't want to harm the church further in the way we resist. We want to actually edify the church and strengthen it.
Good. We have probably about 10 minutes left, so hopefully, oh my goodness. We're gonna go there with yes, you. Because I know we talked about before and you had written up questions. Then I'll try to get back to this side if we can.
Question for Dr. Trueman. You talked about restoring boundaries, suggesting using the weapon of the word and sacrament to restore boundaries. I'd like you to unpack that a little bit,
Yeah.
but also ask about another weapon to restore boundaries, namely the sword of the civil magistrate,
Yeah.
and what role that has, and whether you think under our current regime, whether that's even possible.
Well, I think with God, to take the second question first, I think with God, all things are possible. I think as Christians, we're commanded to pray for the civil magistrate. Whenever I led worship when I was pastoring on a Sunday, I would always pray. I would always give thanks for the civil magistrate. And I would pray that the civil magistrate would use the power that was given to him to protect the innocent and to put down the unrighteous, to crush the wicked, if you like. I have no problem in doing that whatsoever. What I don't want to see is the church taking to itself the power of the civil magistrate. I don't see it my role as a pastor to tell my people to take up arms against the civil magistrate, for example. So, yes, the civil magistrate, I think, has an obligation to protect the weak and to frustrate or confound the wicked. The civil magistrate will have to answer for how he or she does that before God at the end of time. I can have a certain role in that. I can pray for them. I can use my vote. I can go to school board meetings. There are all kinds of things I can do in order to try to influence the civil magistrate. Whenever I do that, I think I have to do it in a manner consistent with Christian character. I don't think that the New Testament gives me any grounds for thinking that I can behave as badly as my opponents may do in order to achieve political goals. That's certainly not Peter's position. It doesn't seem to be Paul's position. It doesn't seem to be Jesus's position. So Christian character, I think, applies in the way that I put pressure on the civil magistrate. In terms of the restoring boundaries within the church, I would say, who are the people who have most shaped my own moral intuitions? Bottom line is, it was not legislation from Westminster when I grew up that did that. It was my mum and dad. I didn't grow up in a Christian home, but when I joined the church, it became the church. I don't think we should underestimate the power of the friends we have, the church we belong to, the power of the Spirit working through the word and sacrament as God has promised to transform those of us within the church. I think that's very important. And again, I don't want to bang on about social media, but one of the things that I would strike again and again when I was a pastor was to people in my church doing crazy stuff on social media was, don't do something on social media trying to influence people over whom you can never have any influence, that actually undermines your credibility of having influence with the people that you sit next to in the pew on a Sunday. We all like to think in the internet age that Donald Trump is going to pay attention to our tweet and change his policy. No, he's not. But the person sitting next to you may be influenced in how they treat their wife because of the way they see you treating your wife. So I would want to operate on two things. Certainly, I have no problem with Christians campaigning for laws that reflect what I would describe as biblical values. One of the reasons I'm at the Ethics and Public Policy Center is I think there is ground that can be made. I don't like the language of regime for what's going on. I know it can have a technical political side. I'd prefer to think of it as the civil government. I think the work that my colleague Claire Morrell has done on pornography, for example, indicates that even cross-party work can have an impact if we're prepared to put in the hours necessary to do so. But I also think that we should not despise the local church as an engine of change. Paul says, bad company corrupts morals. Paul is clearly aware that who we hang around with shapes how we think. So I want to say, I don't want to offload responsibility for civic righteousness to the civil government. It has a role. I also think I have a role as a local Christian in shaping my church and my community.
All right. Oh man, there's so many questions that people. I think you. There was someone over here before who had their. Was it you? Okay, we're going for you then. Someone in this category that I noticed before Alistair. Sorry.
This is for Kevin. Kevin, last night you said two things. I think I agree with both of them, but I also feel like they're in tension. So I'd love for you to maybe
Yeah.
release the tension. So you talked about the importance of religious liberty, kind of almost in a defensive posture. We might not be in charge one day, so we want to allow people to have the religion that they want. But you talked about the cultural acceptance of homosexuality kind of affecting the cultural conscience. And you didn't really flesh that out, but it seemed like you thought that was a bad thing,
Yeah.
right? So how do you sort of hold those two ideas together? This cultural acceptance over here went in a bad direction, but we want to allow for this kind of acceptance over here. Does that make sense?
I think so. So I think the way in my own mind, where they're not in tension is toleration and religious freedom, liberty as a legal principle. We know it's enshrined in the First Amendment. Some have gone so far as to say that the First Amendment language owes something even to maybe the Presbyterian language and the revision of the American standards of the Westminster, or at least it's all kind of happening at the same time. It is an amazing providential, and early Presbyterians made a lot of this, that in 1787 you have literally within shouting distance of each other. You have the Constitutional Convention writing the national constitution, and you have the Presbyterians writing their church constitution, some people going back and forth. So Presbyterians love to see the providence and what the Lord was doing with both of these things at the same time down the road in Philadelphia. And the Presbyterians are meeting in Second Presbyterian Church, which is now a Greasy Spoon pizza parlor. So you can just, what that says about who we are and
Philadelphia.
what we value. Yeah. So I absolutely, and I'm glad for the question, because sometimes in the things I've written and trying to make the case that I think the American revision to the Westminster Standards are mutually exclusive with the original standards in 1646. I don't mean that to be a defense of the status quo in 2025, let alone a historical argument that 18th century Christians and Presbyterians conceived of any kind of naked public square. They assumed that Christianity had a privileged place. Now, as a pastor, I want to hasten to add that the Great Commission is not go therefore and make Christianity a public truth in your land. But I think that's a good thing. And I think there's a world of difference between a Christian culture and cultural Christians. There's an overlap there. As a minister, I don't want Christians who are merely nominally culturally Christian, not truly born again. I preach to undermine that sort of thing. And at the same time, to have a culture that shares and assumes certain Christian things. Certainly my younger self 20 years ago would have been much more negative against any kind of civil religion. You realize, well, when you fly a trans flag, it's a civil religion. A country cannot do with it. You can be in communist China, and the party is the civil religion. A nation has to have something. So it's, how does one come to that? Is it by legal means? Is it by top down? Or, I had Alan Gelzo on my podcast a while ago and asked this question. And so I feel good passing on his answer, because otherwise it seems sort of trite. But if I say it came from him, it sounds profound. He basically said, we need to go win people to Christ and get them in our churches and train them up again. It's not that exclusively to the standing up and the legal things and the strategy of the Federalist Society. But I'm thinking as a pastor and what my role is to preach the gospel and disciple people. And so absolutely, if the Presbyterians were in control, I hope that we would still gladly, on Christian principles, allow for civil liberty, religious freedom, understanding that that's a good on Christian grounds, not merely pragmatic grounds. At the same time, I would love to see the sorts of cultural assumptions that once existed in America exist again.
We would ban the Baptists.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
It goes without saying.
Yes. Out of love. Out of love, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah. Hard but fair.
One time, the Belgian Confession, Article 36, is a very hard line civil magistrate, kind of as the avenger and punishing the Anabaptists, and the CRC changed that, and I think rightly so. Kuiper and Bavinck in the Netherlands issued a gravamen against that original version of the Belgian Confession. Well, I just bring that one time in my last church years ago. I think we had the associate pastor preaching or something, and he was putting the service together, and just like we often do, put a confessional element. I think he put the original version of the Belgian, and I heard it when I came back the next week. Pastor, we were basically, everyone started looking, are we supposed to be saying this? We're bringing Anabaptists to the sword. Everyone's saying it with great confidence, and realize maybe we don't think this anymore. And I for one am glad we don't.
Me too. We're gonna stop the questions here for the sake of time. There'll be a little bit of conversation afterwards, I'm sure. But let's give a hand to our panel.